This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. This week on the Anthrobiology Podcast, I interviewed Dr. Bernard Wood. This interview was conducted back in August of 2019. This show's going to be a real treat, and I wanted to give you kind of a preview into what you're going to be hearing about. The main thing that we talk about in this show is really what can we actually know in anthropology, especially paleoanthropology, which is a discipline that looks far back into the evolutionary past. One of the main problems in paleoanthropology is frequently that sample sizes are very, very small. So it's hard to know what we know for sure. And this is basically what Dr. Wood is meditating on throughout the episode. He also has a lot of thoughts on science and how it's constantly evolving and why that's really important for us, both as anthropologists and in general in the academic community, and for humans everywhere. The other thing I really want you to watch out for is cow dung. You'll know it when you hear it. Later on, we explore why Dr. Wood does anthropology and why we as a species can benefit from people doing anthropology. And Dr. Wood also offers advice to students throughout the show. Just a couple other notes on this show. One of the things that you'll hear me mention is the March to Progress diagram. I realize I didn't do a very good job in the moment of explaining it, but this is this classic depiction of human evolution from the hunched over ape through like Homo erectus going on to man standing upright and striding away gracefully into the future with his tools and loincloth. That's what I'm talking about in that picture. And this is just like a really classic way of displaying evolution, but it's not necessarily the most accurate depiction. The second note that I wanted to give is that you may hear cop cars and an ambulance in the background of this interview. Since we did the interview in Dr. Wood's office in DC, sometimes you hear some city noises on the recording. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy the show. Hello everyone, this is Gabby LaPera. I'm here with Dr. Bernard Wood at his office in George Washington University in the... How do you say the name of your program, sir?
This is the Center for the Advanced Study of Human Paleobiology, which is a pretty pretentious title, but I was attracted by the acronym CASH, but and then with the P at the end of it.
I am here to talk to you today about a paper that you gave me and that you completed fairly recently. The Principles and Practice of Human Evolution Research, Are We Asking Questions That Can Be Answered? I think before we dive into that, I would love it if you could give listeners just a little bit of a background into what you do.
What I do is to use morphology to try and reconstruct human evolutionary history. And I'm interested in working out what happened between the hypothetical common ancestor of modern humans and chimpanzees and bonobos, which, if we're to believe the molecular biologists, was probably living around 6 to 8 million years ago. It's pretty clear that unless there is even more homoplasy than I am prepared to accept, there are quite an interesting bunch of species involved in our evolutionary history.
Can I ask you real quick, what is homoplasy?
Homoplasy is the appearance of the same morphology in taxa that aren't necessarily each other's closest relatives. And so if you're interested in the reconstructing human evolutionary history from the fossil record, you have to use morphology. You have to use the phenotype. And the assumption is, it's an assumption that we make every day, that the more alike people look, the more they are likely to be each other's closest relative. So if you had a sister, then it's likely that you resemble that person more than you do somebody plucked at random from the street. And we use that principle when we're reconstructing evolutionary history. In other words, if we share morphology with another species, we assume that we are closely related to them. It appears that although that is the case much of the time, it's not the case all of the time. And it might not be the case actually even for a substantial minority of the time, which means that the only evidence we have access to if we're paleontologists or paleoanthropologists, might not be completely reliable about predicting the closeness of relationships. Now, that's a long way of explaining that if that's the case, then we clearly have a challenge. And we know that homoplasy exists because once it was possible to use molecular evidence to work out how closely related species were, it became apparent that there were many species that, on the basis of morphological evidence, people thought were each other's closest relative, turned out from the molecular evidence not to be.
Can you give some examples of that?
Baboons, for example. There are the notion of a baboon-like monkey. All baboon-like monkeys don't necessarily belong to the same monophyletic group, which is another word I need to explain, and that which is the same as a clade. In other words, one would assume that all baboon-like monkeys were each other's closest relatives, but that's not the case. Baboon-likedness has evolved several times in old world monkeys.
I was actually reading that for wolves, one would think that their closest relatives are coyotes. It's actually dogs.
Yeah. So it's clear that morphology is not as reliable as we had assumed it was for reconstructing relationships. And the difficulty is that if the only evidence you have access to is fossils, then the only type of evidence you have access to is morphology. And if from observing the relationships of living animals for which we have other evidence, i.e. molecular evidence, now we know that it's unreliable from work on living animals, we have to assume it's also unreliable when we're looking at the fossil evidence.
So what you're saying is actually something that's really profound for the field of paleoanthropology, because up until fairly recently, that is how paleoanthropologists were drawing conclusions, correct?
That's how we all worked. And that was what's known as conventional wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And C.H. Waddington was an embryologist who said conventional wisdom should not always be trusted. And he said you should distrust what he called the conventional wisdom of the dominant group. And he had this wonderful acronym, which is COWDUNG, the conventional wisdom of the dominant group. And I like it because one of the things you have to do as a scientist is once conventional wisdom begins to accumulate, you need to be skeptical about it. So I say to students, to graduate students, if you're looking for a project for your thesis, think about something that everybody agrees about and then look at it.
So my first question upon hearing all this is, I have taught undergraduates, and I think that a lot of them would hear this and think, well, does this mean that evolution for humans isn't true?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly justified to just say, well, that means that you guys were incompetent, because you were making assumptions that you now tell us aren't justified. I'm not saying that all morphology can't be used to recover relationships. I'm saying that it's not 100% reliable. In fact, I'm saying it may be not much more than 70% reliable. Our job is to find out whether there is any morphology which is a homoplasy-free zone, in which case we can rely on that morphology to construct relationships. Or my job is to find out whether there are parts of the body, parts of the skeleton and the dentition, which are particularly prone to homoplasy, in which case we should avoid using that evidence to reconstruct relationships. And that's what we're doing at the moment.
And I think that's a very integral part of science that maybe the average person who doesn't hang out with a lot of scientists maybe doesn't understand, is that you're constantly, hopefully, self-reflecting and trying to improve upon the process of Stein's?
Sure, yeah. I mean, at the moment, I am assuming that the relationships which are worked out using DNA are a more reliable reflection of the tree of life than relationships that I would work out using tooth morphology or the morphology of bones. Now, I think that is, at the moment, a reasonable assessment of the evidence. It may turn out that that's not the case. I think it's unlikely to turn out not to be the case. But you can't assume something is 100% sort of gold-plated. There are some things that are 99.9%, but you certainly, if you're trying to reconstruct evolutionary history, you need to get used to the idea that it's not just a question of finding new fossils. It's also a question of making sure that you are thinking about the fossil evidence in the most sensible way.
Certainly. I think that this is a term that I actually first heard from you a long time ago, that there are kind of two camps, especially in anthropology, lumpers and splitters. And lumpers tend to say, well, we don't know that is a new species. Like we should be conservative. We should be cautious. We should wait until there's more evidence or more available tools to process this evidence. And then there's splitters who, every time they find a new fossil, they're like, new species, so excited about it. How does this feed into what you're saying?
I think lumping and splitting is essentially making decisions about how many species are represented in the fossil record is ultimately a subjective decision. My job is to make sure that subjectivity is as intelligent and as well informed as possible. It's pretty clear that there are lots of living animals that are perfectly good species whose dentition and skeleton are virtually indistinguishable. I mean, there are examples of monkey species. There are monkeys with blue faces, there are monkeys with green faces, and there are monkeys with pink faces. The ones with blue faces only breed with other monkeys with blue faces. The one with green faces only breed with monkeys that have green faces. Their limb bones and their teeth are more or less indistinguishable. So these are examples where there is a perfectly good species that if you only had evidence from the teeth and the limb bones, you would not know that they were different species. Mm-hmm. And so my inclination to think is that the fossil record is always chronically underestimating the number of species. Having said that, just because you find a new fossil site and you find a bunch of hominins, some of which lay outside the range of variation of the existing site samples of that species, does not necessarily mean you have a new species, because the existing site samples don't necessarily reflect the variation within the species. They are samples. So there are reasons why I think paleontologists have a tendency to overestimate the number of species, and there are reasons why I think fossil evidence probably chronically underestimates the number of species. My job is to find the sweet spot,
the balance.
The balance between those two things.
And in terms of the fossil remains that exist, they tend to be very old, I assume.
Well, the most of the fossil evidence that I'm most familiar with is between about 3.5 million years old and about 1 million years old.
And I'm assuming that not a lot of things preserve for that long.
No, well, what you have to realize is that the chance of an individual hominin living 2 million years old becoming a fossil is infinitesimally small. Mm-hmm. So when an individual dies, it's the chances of it ending up as a fossil 2 million years later, being discovered by a group of people looking at a new fossil site is really very small. And we also know that there are biases. So by and large, larger individuals are more likely to fossilize. Larger teeth are more likely to fossilize. denser bones are more likely to end up in the fossil record. So we not only are forced to rely on the morphology of bones and teeth, we are forced to rely on the morphology of those teeth and those parts of the skeleton that are more likely to fossilize. And those parts might not necessarily be the parts that are good for taxonomic identification or for generating hypotheses about relationships. So we have a biased sample of the regions of the skeleton. We have a biased sample of individuals. And those biases may or may not be leading us to have to work with a database which might be helpful for answering the questions that we're asking. Now, all this sounds, this sounds so hopeless. Why does anybody do it?
My next question. Why? How did you end up here? Why are we here, Dr. Wood?
Well, somebody wiser than me said, the sciences are divided into the hard sciences like chemistry and physics and the soft sciences like sociology and psychology. Somebody said paleontology, of which paleoanthropology is a part, is neither a hard or a soft science. It's a difficult science. In other words, you are working with pretty slim pickings in terms of evidence. You are likely to be less wrong if you understand the evidence as well as possible. In other words, you understand the biases which are involved in the evidence. You understand how good that evidence is at answering the questions that you're asking it. And often that means not working on fossils. It means working on living animals for which you have much more evidence, because you can see them behave, you can see which interbreed with which, you can look at their DNA. And so my sense is we need to practice being paleontologists by working on living animals, pretending the only thing we know about them are their teeth and their bones, and pretending that the only thing we know about their teeth and bones are the parts that are more likely to fossilize. And so it's like playing war games. You're taking a situation where you have more evidence than you would do if you were at war, because you can work out who's going to have which arms and who's going to be mobile and not mobile. And so it's the equivalent of doing war games, and which is why I always encourage students get to know the living taxa that are most closely related to modern humans, instead of saying, oh, I'm interested in human evolutionary history, I want to go and find fossils. Well, that's fine, but
it might not help push the science
forward. It might not help push the science forward. It just may mean that you are just making the same mistakes using slightly more evidence.
I saw a really interesting book recently where an illustrator was given a bunch of bones and asked to imagine what the creature might look like.
Right.
And based on just the bones, like, the biologist knew what it was, but this guy just came up with all sorts of things. And I always imagine that when you see reconstructions at museums of how people, because you don't really 100% know what the superficial structures look like either.
No, I mean, there are some fossil hominins that I'm particularly interested in that belong to Paranthropus boisei, which is a most strange creature that if you couldn't make it up, I mean, if we didn't have the fossils for it, you would never have predicted.
What makes them so strange?
Because they look so strange. There is no living primate that's a good model for them. They have flat faces, they have tiny canines, they have large chewing teeth. They look like nothing, I mean, the closest analogy is that they might be like, pandas as to bears. These are sort of creatures with large chewing teeth. There are some lemurs that look a bit like Paranthropus boisei, but that's the closest in the fossil record. So these are creatures for which we have no useful living analog. And that makes them really interesting as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing that makes them really interesting as far as I'm concerned is that they live alongside creatures which are much more likely to be our ancestors.
And I think that this is something that a lot of people miss. I think a lot of people imagine that classic image, the march to progress, where you have the crouching into
Sure.
the human. And they don't realize that there are a lot of offshoots in the course of evolution that just go nowhere.
They, but having said that, Paranthropus boisei has a fossil record which is about 1 million years long in terms of time.
Which is much longer than ours.
Which is much longer than ours. And so these creatures, it's wrong to say, oh, well, they didn't make it. Well, they made it for 1 million years. We don't know why they went extinct. We don't know whether it was a competition with more, with fossil hominins that were better able to extract resources from the environment. We don't know why they went extinct, but we know that they lived for 1 million years. And I think it's really interesting to find out, well, what were they eating? How were they moving around? How were they interacting with the other hominins living at the same time? And creatures which aren't our ancestors or are highly unlikely to be our ancestors, they don't really attract a lot of attention. I mean, most people, oh, well, when's the earliest modern human? When's the earliest member of the genus Homo? These guys are not in that competition at all. Because, it's pretty clear that they are not our direct ancestors. That puts a lot of people off, which means that, there aren't so many people breathing down your neck. And it's, in terms of biology, I think these creatures are really interesting. And it's very challenging to try and reconstruct the lifeways of something that is so exotic.
I think that a question that people will have while listening to this is, so why is what you do important?
I used to be a doctor and I used to be a surgeon. It's very difficult to argue that paleoanthropology is as important as saving somebody's life. But my sense is that the more we understand about ourselves, the more likely we are to behave responsibly. And sometimes in order to understand yourself, you have to look at other people. And looking at these extinct hominins puts us in more of a useful perspective. I mean, last night I went to look at a performance at the cinema from the Royal Shakespeare Company of Measure for Measure, which is a play, much to my shame, I had never seen before. And, here was a play that was written in the 17th century, took place in Vienna, and was reconstructed in sort of interwar or Vienna at the turn of the century. And on the surface had absolutely nothing to do with our present predicament. Yet it had everything to do with our present predicament. And so I think in biological terms, we can understand more about ourselves by understanding the creatures that lived alongside us, not only the closely related ones, but we can also learn more about ourselves by understanding the other mammals that were living alongside us. And that's what interests me. Whether anybody should pay me a decent salary for doing it is a matter for society to come, to make a judgment. I teach non-science majors in the honors program here about human evolution.
How does that go?
Well, these are young people who are doing political science or history or international affairs. My argument to them is that if you're doing international affairs or history or political science, it's about the behavior of modern humans. The more you understand about the evolutionary history of modern humans, the more you're likely to understand about how they behave at the moment.
Yeah, understanding the truth in the past.
Well, let's not be
too dramatic.
Let's not get into truth. I mean, I'm not in search of truth. I'm in search of being less ignorant.
I'm taking that in. I think that's going to change my perspective. Thank you. So I don't want to take up too much of your valuable time. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Is there any story from your career that you want to talk about? Is there any advice that you want to give?
I mean, my career has been sort of governed by opportunities that sort of came along and were unplanned. And I think if you just need to go with the flow. Sometimes if an opportunity comes up, you don't say, well, I'm not going to take that opportunity because it's not part of my plan. Well, maybe it's close enough to my plan. I mean, I had no idea what paleoanthropology was when I was a kid. My parents had a grocery store. They lived in the middle of London. They had no interest in natural history. I had no interest in natural history. I was not fascinated by dinosaurs. I went to medical school not because I wanted to save the world, but because I happened to deliver groceries to a nice couple. He was a cardiologist and she was a pediatrician. And I thought, they're nice people. Maybe I'll do what they do. So that wasn't a hugely compelling reason to go to medical school, but that's what I did. And then when I was at medical school, I discovered that there was this way of using your anatomy to reconstruct evolutionary history. And I never knew that. And I liked anatomy, and I discovered that probably you should only be a surgeon if that's the only thing you could possibly do. And it wasn't the only thing I could possibly do. I was interested in human evolution, so I decided not to be a surgeon and to be interested in human evolution. My son's a surgeon. I think that's just about the only thing that he, he just loves it.
Right.
And yet if you, say to him, what else might you do? He said, well, if I stop doing surgery, I'd like to go into palliative care. And you think, wow, that's a big difference. But he's a cancer surgeon, so it's not a million miles away.
Right.
And, he understands how important the end of life is. And so he says, I might stop doing surgery and go and work in a hospice. But he's not going to do anything else,
Right.
He's not going to do anything else.
I will say, if anyone listening to this ever gets the chance, it's a strong recommendation to take an anatomy class. It's fascinating and a really worthwhile endeavor, I think.
Yeah, I think knowing how the body is put together and, makes you a better consumer of healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And learning about anything is worthwhile. Learning about your own body, I think, is particularly worthwhile.
Certainly. Okay, so here are my last 3 questions for you. Is there a book that you would recommend to people who are interested in paleoanthropology generally? It's a big question. This is the one where everyone always says, this is the hardest question you've asked me.
Well, I'm going to answer this in a very un-British way, because I'm going to recommend a book I wrote myself.
Okay.
There is a series that the Oxford University Press have, which is called Very Short Introductions. And they asked me to, quite a long time ago, to do a very short introduction to human evolution. And I did that, and I've recently revised it. And the second edition, I think, is coming out this month or next month. That's a really good guide for the non-specialist.
Okay.
It's the sort of thing you can read on a plane journey. It's a great series. I don't think mine is, a particularly great example of the series, but it's a great series. So that's what I would advise somebody who is not an expert. Find a book that's pretty short, pretty clear, and there may be others, but I've given you an example of one. It's pretty short, it's pretty
perfect.
clear, and it's pretty cheap.
And I love cheap things. Second question, what are you reading for work right now?
I have just bought a book about archaeology and about sort of asking the skeptical questions I'm asking about paleoanthropology, about archaeology. What can archaeology actually tell us, as opposed to what do we think it's telling us?
Do you know the title?
It's at home and I don't know the title.
Don't worry about it.
The other book that I'm I've been reading, and I confess it's probably the first time I've read it as carefully as I read it this time, is The Descent of Man by Charles Darwin. And I tend to read more than one book at a time. And I bought in a secondhand bookshop a book by a man called Randall Keynes, who's Charles Darwin's great-grandson, maybe great-great-grandson. And it's a book about Charles Darwin, about one of his daughters, Annie, who died probably of tuberculosis when she was 10 years old, and the impact that had on Charles Darwin. I'm much more likely to read nonfiction than I am fiction.
I have been the same for a long time. I'm trying to read a little bit more nonfiction. My coworkers in my day job, I'm an editor, and so they constantly recommend fiction to me. Although I admit right now I'm reading the autobiography of a doctor who practiced medicine in rural Alaska in the 70s. So it's been nonfiction.
My sense is that the best way to interest students in science is to get them to read biographies of scientists. I think it's much more accessible if you can relate scientific discoveries to individuals.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for your time. Unless there's something else you'd like to say.
No, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
An excellent interview, and hopefully we'll talk to you again.
Okay.
All right. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear, at Sound of Picture.